I couldn't tell you what our 3-month retention rate is for a user. Like, I just don't care anymore. There are, by the way, metrics that I do know by heart, of
Uh-huh.
course, but it's just a significantly less number of metrics.
Yeah.
And those metrics are the ones that I really pay attention to. And I'm just far more affected by anecdotes. I am far more affected by, someone who says, hey, I don't really trust Maven when they send this email. And even though our open rates and click-through rates might be staying the same, and I'll look at those to evaluate it, I'll also note that in my head as like, okay, that's really important because I trust this person and I'm willing to make a decision just based on what my qualitative understanding is of a situation rather than just my quantitative one.
Today on the Eric Ries Show, something a little different. This is the truffle episode. I'll explain in a second. My guest today is Gagan Biyani, a serial entrepreneur who has left his mark on education in the world. You probably know him best as the co-founder of Udemy, the global online learning platform that's revolutionized how millions of people access education. But Gagan didn't stop there. He's back at it, tackling the future of professional learning with a company called Maven. And in between, he built a food service company called Sprig. As you'll hear, I was a customer. In our conversation, Gagan shares some fascinating insights that I think every founder can learn from. So why is it the truffle episode? One of the stories that Gagan shares in our conversation was about a tiny little thing that Sprig did right. It gave you this delicious free truffle at the end of every meal. It was free, it was a small thing, and yet it became a metaphor for the pitfalls of what Gagan calls MBA thinking, and how startups can unintentionally erode trust with their customers. Because one day, the truffle was gone. And Gagan shares in this conversation how that seemingly insignificant act of cost cutting had far greater costs than the 50-cent truffle they saved on every meal. In this story, you'll see the constant tension between intuition and data. And Gagan shares how, as he has grown and matured as a founder, he's learned to balance them in new ways. We talk about some pretty difficult personal stuff that Gagan's had to deal with, including his own exit from Udemy, tensions in co-founder dynamics, and some of the things he's learned along the way. This is the truffle episode, but it's not just about food. It's about the hard-earned wisdom that I hope every founder will learn from as they try to build something truly meaningful. Let's dive in with Gagan Biyani. Gagan, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's great to catch up. I guess I want to just jump right to it, if you don't mind, even though it's kind of picking up the story in the middle. I kind of think of this as the truffle episode. So it's a little different than what we've done with some of our other interviews, but you shared this story the other day that I just really caught my attention about what you called MBA thinking and how it led to the downfall of a certain company. And it involved the truffle, and that, of course, makes it a sweet story. But I'm especially interested in it, not just because I've known you for a long time, but because I actually remember the incident in question. I was a customer of your company, and I can remember the truffle really vividly. And so it really stuck in my imagination. And so I wonder if you'd be willing to kind of take it step by step, like slow it down and actually talk about how you got into that situation and what you meant. We can kind of take it bit by bit and try to think about what it means for how founders are counseled to build companies these days.
Yeah. So as a CEO of Sprig, one of the really brilliant innovations from our team early on was that when we were delivering meals, we would offer a free truffle to every customer at the door. And this truffle was, honestly, it was ridiculously good. It was probably one of the best truffles I had, on top of the fact that it provided this sort of sweet treat at the end of a healthy meal, which created, of course, I realized later that it created this sort of addictive element and a positive association for our brand. And on some level, we knew that, but as we were growing, we were also realizing that our unit economics were upside down, and we were losing money, and we were losing more money on every meal as we continued to grow, which meant that our burn rate was climbing. I think at some point we hit $2 million a month in burn, which is wild, especially for a company at our size and how much we had raised at that time. In an effort to save money, we started to look at every line item and try to cut it. And we made a lot of really smart decisions to cut it. And then we also made a lot of dumb decisions. And probably one of the ones I regret the most is cutting the truffle. And we used to give it for free. And instead, we decided to start selling cookies. And these cookies were also outstandingly good. And we offered the cookie for free to our first customers. So we did mitigate the truffle. But I think in general, the thinking that led to the truffle and the cutting of all of our costs also led to it exacerbated our already inevitable demise. And we saw over the next couple of years that our revenues, instead of growing on a weekly basis, started to decline. They were not directly correlated with the truffle, by the way. They were correlated with other exogenous circumstances. But I think if I'm thinking qualitatively about the situation in retrospect, we certainly did not do ourselves any favors with that mistake.
Well, I can remember the truffles. They were really delicious. This episode is brought to you by Vanta. If you're a startup founder, then product market fit is obviously your number one priority. But to land bigger customers, you also need security compliance. And obtaining your SOC 2 or ISO 27001 certification can open those big doors. But they take time and energy, pulling you away from building and shipping. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta is the all-in-one compliance solution helping startups get audit ready and build a strong security foundation quickly and painlessly. Through the platform, access trusted experts to build your program, auditors to get you through audits quickly, and a marketplace for essentials like pen testing. So, whether you're closing your first deal or gearing up for growth, Vanta makes compliance easy. Join over 8,000 companies, including many Y Combinator and Techstars startups who trust Vanta. Simplify compliance and get $1,000 off at vanta.com/Eric. That's VANTA.com/Eric. This episode is brought to you by Gusto. I'm a huge fan of Gusto. I've used the product myself across many companies, many startups, large, small business, venture-backed, you name it. I've used Gusto for payroll, for benefits, for employee onboarding, HR, even small group health insurance for nearly any budget. Best of all, Gusto pays all your federal, state, and local payroll taxes in all 50 states. It turns an incredibly time-consuming and painful process into the click of a button. That's why I like Gusto. Oh, and if you're listening to this, you can get 3 months free at gusto.com/Eric. That's gusto.com/ERIC. You called it an example of MBA thinking. And it was kind of like, at least how I remember it, is like, it wasn't that the truffle led to the demise of the company. Obviously, there were other issues. But that it was kind of like the canary in the coal mine, or like a harbinger of other changes to come. And I wonder if you could talk about your mindset at the time. I think it's very natural. A lot of people listening to this, especially people, from the 2021 vintage of startups, have been working hard to bring burn rate down. So I'm sure a lot of them are like, yeah, giving away free stuff to your customers when your unit costs are upside down, that doesn't make sense. So like a lot of VCs are telling founders, look, you got to cut costs right now. You got to do it. What was wrong with that way of thinking?
I think we misunderstood the core thing that Sprig was selling. So in any industry, there is a different reason people buy your product. And, in SaaS, it's probably even more complicated than that. But I know consumer, and in consumer, people have a different brand association with different types of businesses, and their underlying motivation it varies greatly. So as an example, we'll talk about this later, but in Udemy and Maven in education, people are buying, to some extent they're buying trust, to some extent they're buying value, and to some extent they're buying transformation. So you need to deliver those three things when you are selling an online learning product. In the case of the food industry, I think what we were selling was delight. We were selling reliability, and we were selling, a sort of emotional connection with the brand, right? Trust, but like it goes deeper than trust you would have with an online course. And the truffle was an example of a moment in which we provided delight and created trust. And we didn't create trust directly, like no one cares whether we provide the truffle. Like their active brain is not thinking, oh my God, I trust Maven more. But subconsciously, it created this connection that like we're thinking about you.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a very deep type of trust, right? It's an emotional trust. It's, hey, we actually know that you just took a bunch of effort to order Sprig instead of ordering, DoorDash or Postmates and getting some shitty burger, right? Like you ordered a healthy meal, like, and we're thinking about you. And the trust is the truffle is a moment where we tell you, hey, Eric, we thought about you and we wanted to reward you because we were proactively caring for you. So there's a hospitality in that. And I think it was very easy for us, we had 4 co-founders, but 2 of us really ran, the core decisions of the company. And both of us came from business backgrounds with no experience in hospitality or food. And I think it was very easy for us over time. In the beginning, when we had all the money in the world and were, early in our business, so we were just doing whatever we could to delight customers. That's when we introduced the truffle. But it was easy for us over time to start to analyze the business in spreadsheets. And we got really obsessed with our spreadsheets, right? And we got sufficiently obsessed that we were not recognizing enough of the realities of the food business, which is that there's extremely low switching costs, and loyalty is driven by feeling and emotions. And so we cut the truffle as part of many other changes we made to the business to try to get the unit economics profitable. And in reality, we probably should have made other decisions. Like we probably should have been willing to raise prices faster. We probably should have just said, look, it's not $16 a meal anymore. It's 22. And, we should have been willing to take the cut in our user base that would have accompanied that. And then built back up from a delightful experience, from a smaller user base, and built a more delightful experience. Now, those are really hard changes in retrospect. They're easy in retrospect, but hard at the moment. But
So hard.
Giving you a little insight into what I would do differently.
Well, I think it's really important because one of the recurring themes in these conversations has been how trustworthiness is an asset that companies undervalue. And I just think your example is so great. Food service, people think of food as a low margin business, as, not, so when you talk about, you gotta really trust your food vendors, people sometimes look at me funny. But of course, like food is something you physically ingest it and put it in your body and it can kill you. So the level of trust you have to have with a food service business is actually very, very high. We don't like to think about it too explicitly. And I think it's just really, I really like the way that you put it, that you have built something like this emotional connection, and deeper than the word trust implies. I think we don't even have a word to describe this feeling of connection that people have with a company or a product when they feel like that company cares for me. Like my well-being is in fact important to the people that work there. And again, I wanted to start with a story because I remember that company. I remember being that customer. I was a very early Sprig customer, and I really felt that sensation that you're talking about. It felt really different than other food delivery companies. And what I think is so fascinating about Sprig, and I want you to go back and tell the story of how you got into the food service business, because as you said, that's not your background, and it was an unlikely career pivot. I remember at the time thinking it was really interesting. Yet what you accomplished there is still kind of an unsolved problem. Like for all the proliferation of food service, food delivery, ghost kitchens, I mean, it's been a kind of like crazy proliferation of app-based food acquisition opportunities. I feel like the average quality of food that people are getting delivered is going down. And there's all this exploitation and this feeling that like none of these companies, not even these restaurants, even really care about me. And so there's kind of been this big backlash against the industry as a whole. And I always think back to the one time I felt differently about it was when Sprig was really in its heyday.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of lessons in there. First, to talk about trust, I just want to add in, there's different type of trust, right? There's trust with McDonald's that every time you order a burger, it's going to taste exactly the same. And so if the burger variant started to change dramatically, you might be upset with McDonald's. Whereas if the food variant started to change a lot in Sprig, you wouldn't be upset with Sprig at all, because Sprig changes its menu every day and it's part of it
Variety
that
was
it
part of its
changes.
brand attributes. Exactly.
So it's not just like as simple as trust. It's about truly deeply understanding what type of trust. And the trust that we had with our users was it's not like taking away the trouble, I think, created a lot of negative experiences. I think most people thought to themselves, I get it. It's a hard business. I can't just get a free thing every time
Hmm.
I receive a meal. Like everyone, I think, mostly got it. It's that it was an opportunity to create trust that we had now eliminated. And that opportunity and that type of trust that Sprig had with his customer was, we are thinking about you. Because one of the things that happens when you're ordering Sprig is you want to know that we're thinking about the health of the food without having to read the nutrition facts. You want to feel like the ingredients are of good quality without having to read what farms, we source them from. And so we were actually selling a type of trust that was like a, don't worry, we're handling this for you,
Hmm.
you know? And that's the reason why this was such a particularly good example of the decisions that we made. Now, to talk about the food industry as a whole, the thing I would say is that we had entered a completely new industry that we did not know anything about. This is a normal experience for entrepreneurs, right? This
Hmm.
is like startup founders do this on a daily basis. Most people get into an industry they didn't have existing knowledge in. And in fact, one of the random things I'll say is that as a founder of only consumer businesses in which I do have a lot of affinity for, education. I'm a self-learner and I love learning via courseware. Um, I would say sometimes I'm envious of people who enter industries they don't know as well, because you make a lot more money being a SaaS founder of some HR thing that you've never spent any time on than you do as a founder of education companies, but that's another conversation for another day. So you want to be going after industries that you don't know about. The point is just that you need to learn the underlying motivation of what people are buying, and you have to have enough je ne sais quoi if what you're selling involves sort of emotional based trust. Um, and not everyone is selling that, but if you're a payments provider, you're selling a type of trust,
Hmm.
right? That your rails are always going to be on, that every payment that goes through, that gets requested is going through. So there are many companies out there, Mercury as an example, as a bank, you really need to have a lot of trust in your bank. And so those are types of businesses that need to take trust more seriously than, say, as an alternative example, like Carta. Like cap table software needs a certain level of trust, but I bet their business has been fairly resilient throughout their various PR gaffes, because the amount of trust that you need in Carta isn't as high as it is in Mercury. Now, don't get me wrong, if I were Carta, I wouldn't be making the mistakes they're making, but I still will call out that their level of trust isn't the same.
Yeah. One of the really tricky things is when companies start to lose trust, it's a glacial process. Like the negative consequences are not always apparent immediately. And I can tell you lots of stories, I'm sure you can too, of companies where like you erode that trust for a while. And during the erosion process, you're gaining something. Like I'm sure during the process that you're cutting costs and making the service worse, you think you're making progress because like all of a sudden you're on your at a spreadsheet level, things are getting better and you feel like you're on the right track. And it's only like at a decisive or critical moment later when like your customers start to abandon you en masse, or when you need them to believe you, or like in some kind of crisis situation, that the lack of trust is really costly. I think about like the Silicon Valley Bank collapse and the erosion of trust that they had suffered in the years preceding that event. And so how easy it was for all of their customers to think the worst of them in that key moment when like that herd behavior over the course of like 2 or 3 days probably could have determined whether the bank collapsed or not. They didn't have the goodwill, they didn't have that reservoir built up. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, I think this is a Howard Schultz-ism originally. He called it the reservoir of trust, like the kind of operational playbook for how you build up trust, which was such a critical part of the Starbucks story in its early days. And obviously they've had their issues since. You build trust whenever you engage in a sacrifice on the customer's behalf. So you do something that like costs you something. It has a certain level of pain or difficulty attached to it to the customer's benefit when you didn't necessarily have to do it. You did it because you chose to do it. And I think the example you gave is so great, like this feeling that the company cares about you when it didn't have to. Like nobody was asking for the truffle. It wasn't something you ordered or clicked a box. You didn't pay extra for it. you just received it. It was automatic. And nobody, as you say, nobody really thought about receiving it. Probably nobody thought that much about not receiving it. It was probably only whatever 50 cents in the unit cost one way or the other. It wasn't like a decisive big deal. But even those little touches, you say this is kind of like intangible thing. This is a company that's willing to engage in that sacrifice. I think people who want to turn that insight into a spreadsheet run into trouble. It's like, well, if sacrificing is good, I guess sacrifice everything. But to your point, like getting the unit costs under control was a necessary part of the business's growth. So I'm just curious, you've had some time now to reflect on being in that trap. Talk about like how you think now about balancing those kind of like sacrificial or delighting features that might have additional cost or complexity attached to them against the kind of the more MBA need of the business to be unit cost profitable.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, as a founder, you are, the difference between success and failure is like 100 or 1,000x of growth from wherever you are today. And so you really have to remember that when you're doing MBA thinking, that most sort of spreadsheet decisions are primarily do not appropriately take into account the upside and downside cases of your endeavor, because frankly, like even the human mind cannot understand exponential growth the way that the way that we would like to. Even those of us who literally study exponential growth for over a decade are still shocked when we see an exponential growth curve and are amazed at the outcomes of it when it gets compressed over a
We'll
period
come
of
back
time.
to this when we talk about AI, I'm sure.
Yeah. So my lesson is just, product market fit is not something that can be measured. I think that there are attempts to improve the measurement of it. I love the Rahul Vora and Sean Ellis test, the Rahul Vora framework and the Sean Ellis test, and other examples of that. But you know this better than anyone as someone who did lean startups. There is a certain art to building companies. And if you always A/B test everything, and we saw this, which you and I saw this with a generation of A/B test obsessed companies in the sort of 2010 era, you eventually end up, the best case scenario is you end up with like a $1 billion company. And the more common case scenario is that you end up with a company that does well for a while, and then another company in the same market comes around with a better product that does less A/B testing and more faith-based decision making, and they clean you out because the customer has more of a positive reaction to that company, and you can't figure out why because you're too busy looking at numbers to try to figure out whether or not you're right about how increasing prices affected your retention. And so you simply put, like, at my current company, Maven, it's amazing how much less obsessed I am with numbers than I was in my previous two companies. I thought about this the other day because I was thinking about whether if I was raising money today, because we're like doing pretty well. So I was like, what if I was raising money right now? And I'd be like, shit, I'd have to learn all of our metrics because I don't know most of them. Like I couldn't tell you what our 3-month retention rate is for a user. Like I just don't care anymore. There are, by the way, metrics that I do know by heart, of course, but it's just a significantly less number of metrics. And those metrics are the ones that I really pay attention to. And I'm far more affected by anecdotes. I am far more affected by, someone who says, hey, I don't really trust Maven when they send this email. And even though our open rates and click-through rates might be staying the same, and I'll look at those to evaluate it, I'll also note that in my head as like, okay, that's really important because I trust this person and I'm willing to make a decision just based on what my qualitative assumption is or my qualitative understanding is of a situation rather than just my quantitative one.
Yeah, I think that's a sign of tremendous maturity. And listen, we went in the lean startup movement, we went through a lot of years trying to get people to focus on the critical few metrics that were necessary to be the complement to their very strongly held qualitative beliefs that were impervious to fact checking. So obviously both are necessary. And I would like to hear if you're willing to share a little bit about the metrics that you do and don't buy into for Maven. But One thing I want to drill into first is what you're describing is this attribute that I've had a hard time teaching and trying to explain to people, because everyone's like, look, I either want to hear that faith-based decision-making is everything, or I want to turn my business into a spreadsheet like you did for Sprig. Like we've all been through that phase. And yet what you're describing, where like anecdotes and data combine, is the best founders I know, they develop this like mental model of what is going on. Like they have this like very clear set of understandings about what customers believe, what customers are experiencing, the emotional reality of them, what the brand stands for, how the company works. Like it's a coherent model. It's a set of beliefs that work together. And so anecdotes can be really powerful when something happens that shouldn't be happening. Like the model is very predictable. The reason I think people don't really understand is the model is not saying, I know everything, and therefore I don't need any data. It's just the model makes hyper-specific predictions about what should be happening. When you send an email, you know exactly what's supposed to happen. If that doesn't happen, your alarm bells go off. And people say, well, like just anecdotes. I was like, hold on. If the model says that something should never happen and you have an anecdote that it did happen, that's not an anecdote. That's a violation of the model. So now the key, that the sign of maturity, of course, is you don't freak out and be like, oh my God, therefore like blow the whole company up. It's like, okay, that's an alert. I need to go investigate something to see, is my data correct or is my model correct? And if there's a mental model that's not right, like that's where the really big insights tend to come in, where you're like, oh, my entire understanding of what customers are doing here isn't right.
I'll give you a good example of a similar situation, but on the leadership side.
Mm-hmm.
So Maven for the last 2 years has been roughly like 15 people. And over the last 3 months, we grew to about, closer to 20.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last 3 months, we've also had 2 different situations where someone on the team has done something that violated my mental model of how the team should operate. In one case, someone sent an email under my name without checking in with me about it.
Mm-hmm.
And in another case, someone, a third party, complained publicly about Maven on a Saturday, and I didn't find out about it until a Monday. So these are examples where I felt like, okay, well, anytime an email goes out under my name, people should be asking me, or I should have eyes on it. And then I also felt like, hey, if a PR issue is brewing, like people need to bother me on a Saturday, like it doesn't matter. And it's interesting because I'm currently in real time trying to process just what needs to change here. Mm-hmm. But it's another example where I'm thinking to myself, okay, there is clearly a question in people's mind about when and how to escalate to the CEO. And the prior system, which worked super well, is no longer working. I now need to learn from that and figure out how to update the system. And there are probably other underlying situations that I need to change in order to ensure that future, examples don't come up as well, where escalation was a good solution to a problem but did not get taken.
Yeah, another sign of maturity as an entrepreneur, and I want people to get a chance to understand where this wisdom comes from. But that's exactly right. Seeing the company as a system and people's misbehavior as a symptom of a malfunctioning system, rather than as like, oh, this person needs to be fired, or I need to go yell at that person and tell them not to do that again. That's not efficacious in solving the problem, because of course in lean manufacturing there's saying that every defect is a treasure. One of those like sayings in translation that used to drive me crazy. Like, what are you talking about? But of course, the key is that if you prevent people from telling you that there's a defect, then you're missing an opportunity to inexpensively diagnose some root cause of a problem. So rather than you paper it over, now the problem goes unaddressed and it's going to come back to you in a bigger way. If you actually get to the root cause and try to figure out what it is, that's really key. And I see this in companies that really have some kind of mission or purpose to them. There's this level of coherence that the team has, where everyone kind of understands what the purpose of the company is, and like they understand the company's unique operating playbook. And it's a very common issue that when you hire people from some other equally coherent culture, I used to joke about companies that like hire a bunch of people from Apple and then they hire a bunch of people from Goldman Sachs. And then like they have like a little Goldman Sachs over here and a little Apple over here. Those are both fine companies with great cultures in their own right, but they are not compatible with each other. And now you have this incoherence inside the company. It can, yeah, I mean, I appreciate you sharing the example of just even being at 20 people, that kind of thing can happen. And if you address it early, then you have a chance to like build up the coherent culture that's unique to Maven rather than, waiting to have that thing that emerge into a civil war.
Yeah, you nailed it. Because actually, one of the things, there's two confounding factors here. One is that we have recently brought on a few team members from adjacent companies to Maven, companies that are not competitive, but are very similar to us. And actually, those team members sometimes get a lot of credit coming into your company.
Sure.
And people assume they need less onboarding because they've already done this job before. And they
That's
do
that's
usually need
exactly opposite.
10% less onboarding on the job or 20% less onboarding on the job. But sometimes, like you said, it's the exact opposite. They need 20% more onboarding on the culture because
Mm-hmm.
they've been taught a totally different playbook for how to
Mm-hmm.
deal with workplace dynamics and responding to customers or whatever. And so actually one of the things that I said in my post this morning about the situation, the social media situation I was talking about was, hey, this got escalated to someone who is new. She's only been around for a couple of months. And I hope that everyone else remembers that when someone's new, you need to give them a little extra nudge to do something that might be uncomfortable, like messaging the CEO on Saturday,
Right.
and like that's something that, I needed to add to this moment of learning because I didn't want it all to fall on a new employee who may not at her previous company had to escalate these types of things. And I can totally understand that. But at Maven at the current stage, I wanted a different behavior and I needed to start to teach how that behavior should be
Mm-hmm.
different.
Okay, so I want you to take this lens we've been talking about, this kind of like mental model of what's really happening, the kind of defining the right set of metrics, and of course, in particular, the kind of this tension between the founder way of thinking about it and the more MBA, what you call the MBA way of thinking about it. And like, let's go back and kind of rewind how we got to where you are now. Like you mentioned starting Sprig, you mentioned starting Maven. I think probably most people know you still as a founder of Udemy, which is a multi-billion-dollar success story in the education space. Talk maybe just about like how did you get into entrepreneurship? What did you think it was going to be like, and then maybe tell us a little bit of how it all began.
I got into entrepreneurship because I thought I was going to lose my job and was desperately looking for an alternative. Then I started to do research and read TechCrunch and all these other things on the internet. Um, and I realized, hey, like people like me actually do start companies sometimes. And when I started to see that it was even possible that someone, I was 21 years old, graduated from Cal, like working in consulting, like I didn't know that could lead to or how that would lead to building a business. And so I realized it could. And then I started to look into entrepreneurship as well as joining early stage companies. Um, and I was lucky enough to have a few lucky breaks, right? Like I joined the Founder Institute. I believe you were a mentor for the Founder Institute in that first
Hmm.
cohort. So
That's right.
we met then, and I also became a writer for TechCrunch, and so I did a whole bunch of things. Um, and I think that it's worth noting that my first company, Udemy, in the theme of like understanding qualitatively like how your company operates, I was the user for Udemy, right? I was actually like I was relatively poor, right? Like I didn't come from wealth, and like I didn't make a lot of money as a right out of college. I was someone who was a self learner who would watch videos on YouTube like during my lunch break. So I was like really excited about watching content. Um, I loved learning things. I felt like that was the key to my success as a human and in my career. And so one of the ways to shortcut all of this qualitative, knowledge is just to be the customer for the product. That's a very common way that it happens. However, the only thing I'll add is that over time, you have to learn to have conviction in your own beliefs, because
Mhm.
you may have that underlying, understanding, but you may not always listen to it in favor of MBA thinking, and let this podcast be one of the nudges for you that actually, like, that voice inside your head that, like, hey, the customer's really not going to love this and it matters, or the customer won't mind this and it's going to be okay. Like, that voice is something you really ought to listen to, because your intuition is sometimes more effective at understanding all the variables than what the numbers may say.
Oh yeah, and let me underline that one, because people hear that and they're like, they treat intuition like it's this mystical thing. Like, oh well, I guess if I ignore the data and I just go with my intuition, then I just like basically just do whatever I want and it'll always work out fine. It's like, no. Intuition comes from somewhere. You develop intuition by following a very specific set of practices. And what I think is so interesting is people think that by kind of not listening to their intuition, or kind of a more common thing I see is people compromise. So they're like, okay, my intuition is telling me pretty strongly that like customers aren't going to like this, but the data says otherwise, or an investor says otherwise. And so I'll kind of like do it halfway. So it's like I do half of what they want and half of what I want. And then it goes badly and everybody involved learns nothing. Because the investor's like, if you just done it all the way my way, it would have been fine, because you watered it down with your dumb intuition. It didn't work out. And you yourself don't really know, like, is that true? Or if I'd listened to my intuition all the way. And the power of conviction is when you're wrong, you're really wrong. Like, you actually find out in a way, like in a very clear way, oh, this is I didn't really understand this as well as I did. And of course, if you're a self-reflective person, if you actually then spend the time to get to the root cause of what went wrong, by acting with conviction, you build the skills necessary to develop better intuition and more conviction in the future. So it's, especially earlier in your career, such good advice.
Absolutely agree.
This episode is brought to you by Runway. You ever feel like you're the only one who gets your company's numbers? Like, really gets it? Explaining it to other people can feel like a drag. It's unbelievable to me how many founders, their team doesn't understand how the business works. Well, that's where Runway comes in. It's not just for you, it's for your whole team. By integrating with hundreds of tools to pull in your data, having everything in one place makes it much easier for the whole team to understand how their individual decisions impact the overall business. This is how you build metrics you can believe and you can trust. It's all drag and drop, everything updates instantly, you get real-time investor reports, and everyone can play with the model. When people understand the model, they make smarter decisions. If you want to see how Runway can give your team the clarity they need, head to runway.com/Eric for a demo and your first 2 months free. Okay, so you got into online learning. I remember very clearly when Udemy was starting, because this is classic, as Andrew Chen calls it, the cold start problem. You need teachers to get students. You need students for teachers to want to be there. Talk a little bit about how you got teachers and students on the platform, and kind of how did you get it started?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we did is that we built a massive cold emailing system. Just bringing everyone here back to 2009, it's worth noting that at that time, there was not a lot of educational content on the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
YouTube was not full of educational videos on anything you would search for. It was kind of bare, honestly. And like
Yeah.
lots of topics were unexplained, and then if you were going to find videos on the internet, you would find them, on random people's websites. And oftentimes they would be so old that you would have to download the video to watch them, or you'd have to download like the equivalent of a browser extension. I'm forgetting what it's called today, but like the equivalent of a browser extension in order to be able to watch the videos. Like, you couldn't just hit play and watch educational videos online, right? It was very, very old school. And so the first thing we did was say, hey, there's all these people already trying to teach online. Let's reach out to them en masse. And we didn't know what subject was going to be popular on Udemy. And we also thought at that time that Udemy was going to be a live learning system.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't recorded. So we reached out to anyone who was trying to teach online and just said, hey, do you want to teach on Udemy? And honestly, it didn't work, but it gave us a lot of phone calls and Skype calls, basically, again, dating myself here,
Oh, yeah.
but a lot of Skype calls where we learned what people did want. And this is, my major contribution to Udemy of anything was this one insight, which was that I realized that people did not want to do live online courses at that time in 2009. And you're laughing, but you actually also remember the other company in the space, Edufire, which was the big behemoth in the company, having raised $3 million, um, and and was started by a founder who we all have a lot of respect for, and my co-founders were all dug in on live learning. Right,
Oh
that's what
yeah.
everyone thought was going to happen, and so I through customer development, unintentional customer development. Really, I was just trying to sell the product to
Hmm.
people, and I was getting no takers. I was like, these people are not interested in using the product. And I then went back to my co-founders and said, look, like this isn't going to work. Like people are not going to do live. I think we should do recorded. There's lots of recorded content already online. Like we could put it on the website. People use it, blah, blah. And so it took 6 months of convincing them, I think,
Hmm.
and finally they like decided that I was right. And that we should do recorded content. And then, of course, there were other fateful decisions made by them. Like I wasn't sure we should charge for the courses.
Hmm.
And Aaron, my co-founder, had the insane wisdom to say, no, 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 we got to charge. We need to have a business model. And and so each of us contributed a major decision. But as we made those decisions, we started to intuitively get to a product that actually had potential. And yet, even at that point, we didn't have any users, really, any real users. We had thousands of users or tens of thousands of users who were like putzing around on our website, but we kind of knew at the time that they weren't very engaged and they weren't what I would call real users. They weren't really taking us seriously and spending time on Udemy. They were just kind of poking around until finally I said, screw this. Now this is a full year after,
Hmm.
the start of this story. I said, screw this. I'm going to go and create our first courses.
Hmm.
And so I actually created our first courses. And Eric, I think you were in like the second or third course actually. Um,
I,
and
I remember it very vividly because you had I didn't realize it was because of Founders Institute. We must have been connected through Founders Institute. So shout out to Adeo and the whole team that made that possible. And you had said, look, we should do a lean startup course on Udemy. And I remember trying to come up with every possible excuse not to do it. Because I was like, oh, I don't have time to do I don't have the setup. And every answer, every excuse I would give you, just be like, oh, that's okay. We'll do that for you. And I was like, well, at a certain point, I was like, well, I guess I have to say yes because if they're going to do all the work and make it happen, okay. And it really stuck with me vividly because, of course, that's like a really key part of so many other marketplace stories, startup stories. Like the Airbnb story is the same way, where the founders like actually took first party responsibility for making sure that there's content on the platform. I just thought that was totally brilliant, and I
yeah,
got an awesome lean startup course out of it. I guess it's a little dated now, but like
yeah,
at
I'd be
the time,
curious
it was
if
really
it's still.
awesome.
I'd be curious if it still gets any sales, but I think there's probably newer ones since then. But yeah, at the time, we just had this attitude of, I mean, honestly, it was born out of extreme frustration and desperation, right? Like we were spending months of time with no traction at all. We were burning through our savings. Eventually, we raised a bit of money, but we knew it would only last us so long. And eventually we were like, screw this, we got to go and build this ourselves. And that's what we did. And thank you for being one of the people who said yes, because even when we built it for people, it was still very difficult to get people to do it. But we learned so much in that process. We learned how to market the courses, which then what we could do after that, once we had learned how to market the courses, then we realized, oh, we could get people to make them if we promised that they would make money or that it would be marketed. And so, but we would never have come to that conclusion if it weren't for the fact that we were just like, let's go do this ourselves. Because we didn't even realize at that time that the biggest risk that Eric had was not, you know, uh, whether or not the course would be good. It was whether or not anyone would take it. And we had to prove that people would take it. And actually, we had to prove that it was worth more than you going in person, which is what you and many other experts were mostly doing at that time. Even
Sure.
though you were teaching people how to work on the internet, you were actually using the physical world to deliver
That
a
was all
lot
that
of
was
that
available. Oh
information.
yeah, you give me flashbacks to the time when I used to have to like rent hotel conference rooms and stuff to like do in-person workshops and stuff, and it
Yeah.
was like so lame and corporate and blah. But like that's what people were doing at that time. We didn't know that it could be better. And you're right. The irony, of course, is every single person in the workshop is doing some cutting edge, cool online thing. And here we are, like with our like physical binders to play acting in an older generation of things. Okay, since you asked, I had to look it up. I just looked it up. Yes, I just received on December 5th. I received $23.85 from
Oh my
Udemy.
God.
I still get people are still taking that course. I'm still receiving royalties from Udemy every once in a while. Looks like they religiously I get a monthly update still all these years later. So I guess people are still taking that course.
That's amazing. I'm so glad to hear it.
Yeah, it's super cool. Okay, so that's like, I mean, you couldn't ask for a more like one of these classic overnight success stories, years in the making, and like those are great pivot stories. My favorite pivot stories are the ones where it's kind of obvious in retrospect, but if you had not had the discipline to get desperate, you wouldn't have been able to do it. So like if you had just been stubbornly insisting, no matter what, we're gonna be doing live courses, like wouldn't have happened if you hadn't like really, really, really tried. I think it's a Steve Blank phrase to find customers for the product as currently specified. So instead of going around asking customers what they want, you were like, you have co-founders who have a really strong vision. I know, we both know Aaron Bali really well. He went on to do Carbon Health and other awesome stuff. So like, very strong-willed co-founders, excellent. That's a good formula. And rather than say, look, we're going to ask customers what they want, you're like, no, I got a co-founder with a vision. He knows what he wants. I'm going to go try to find if there are any customers anywhere on this freaking planet for this particular product. And only after you've exhaustively discovered that just absolutely none. And, you took enough time that it's not like, oh, you're just not a good salesperson. It's like, no, we've really thoroughly, exhaustively proven that there's absolutely nobody for this. That can create the conditions for a pivot you wouldn't have previously been willing to consider.
Yeah, sometimes you have to try and fail and then just move forward, and that's totally fine as long as you're not doing it intentionally. Or there's this meme nowadays about people talk about how like you have to fail and therefore they like glorify failure.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
curious
totally.
what you think of that, Eric, because it's happened in large part on the backs of a lot of your, not directly but indirectly. It's part
Yeah,
of the
yeah, I
lean
get that a
startup
lot.
movement. And I think you just said this, but no, failure is bad. Like let's be clear. Like no one wants to fail, and you should do your absolute best to try not to fail, but it is also inevitable. So, just like if you play soccer, you will inevitably fall on your face, right? Like you'll get tripped, you'll fall. That's okay, but you also should not just run head first every time someone's kicking the ball.
Well,
And
yeah, exactly. And the idea that success is a choice, I find really fascinating. It's like I think it's unique to business because it's not like in sports, no one's like, just be like Steph Curry and never miss a shot and you'll be fine. It's like first of all, he misses a lot of shots, and that's the part of the like that's not natural part of the process. You wouldn't be like, oh, he sucks because he missed a shot, but also he's really special, and not the rest of us cannot do what he can do. So even if you like quote unquote make the choice that you're going to be a success, what information is that? That's not helpful. We have to be willing to tolerate failure in order to get to success. But you're right; it's not the same as glorifying failure. In fact, there's a lot of VCs have told me, we went through a phase where people would come into their meetings and talk about what a big failure they were, and they'd be like, "Wow, that guy really let failure go to his head." It's like that. The failure is not valuable. What matters is what do you do with that failure, and failure is only valuable insofar as it leads to learning. In fact, in the academic literature on founders, everyone thinks. Actually, that's not true. Some people have a strong bias that first-time founders are more successful, and other people have a strong bias that second or n-time founders are more successful. And the data shows that they are exactly the same. Because for every person who takes the advantage, as you were talking about, of being the outsider as a first-time founder, you have a corresponding person who like really doesn't know what they're doing and f's it up because they're not willing to learn what the industry or sector they're in requires. And for every second time founder who learned from their first mistake and went on to correct from that and do something better the second time around, I've met so many founders who just make the same mistake over and over again. So they're a repeat founder, but they're just doing the same thing. It's the old definition of insanity. So it's not a given. Like there's no guarantee that failure will lead to learning, but there is a guarantee that not failing, like not even making the attempt, therefore preventing yourself from failing, therefore is guaranteed to prevent you from learning. And that's why we try in Lean Startup to glorify learning, not failure.
I completely agree with that.
Okay, so then it was smooth sailing from there. After it was about 2 years in, you figured out the formula, product market fit, boom,
done.
Everything was great, right?
Didn't have to work a day after that.
So tell us the rest of the Udemy story.
I think that the truth is that it took us almost 5 years until we thought we had product market fit at Udemy. So we, after a year and a half of working on it, we finally hit that moment where we were selling courses and they were working. And but we always felt like we had a gun to our heads, and that at any moment we could just fall apart. And every month we were just trying to grow 20% month over month. We did whatever we could, and most times we hit it. And still, every year we'd look at it and say, and our investors always tell us this in retrospect, they would say, like, you guys were one of my best performing companies, but you acted like you were one of the worst. And I think that's just like partly our personalities, and partly it's the market conditions. Ed tech wasn't very well respected at that time. So it wasn't like anyone was telling us we were doing well. Like everyone was like nervous they were even in this business in the first place. But basically what you have to do as a marketplace as, over time is every month you have to figure out how to get more supply and more demand. And if you don't do one or the other, you will have a setback. So if you don't get enough supply for the next amount of demand that you're getting, then you will notice that your demand shows up and doesn't have as much excitement, even though you have existing supply that you're selling to them. It's kind of like a fact of life that you need to add new supply in order to make new demand, satisfied. And of course, there's limits to that. Like maybe your current supply can double or triple the demand, but at some point you're going to hit the limit of where that current supply can do. But it's really a sales and marketing game. Mm-hmm. In marketplaces. And I think this is dramatically underappreciated because we're used to glorifying engineers and engineering and product design as the main factors that lead to success. And that's because we have such a bias around SaaS companies, right? SaaS is like, I think 70 to 80% of, of VC funding goes towards B2B. And you probably know the actual numbers. I'm truly kind of making those up off of memory, but like, and so almost all of our priors and all of our conventional wisdom apply to those situations where, you are selling to a business and they like, whereas in a market and in that case where you're selling to a business, the conventional wisdom is also that you need to sell to early stage companies first. And so, yes, in the case where you're selling to early stage companies and or technology-based adopters, and you are selling a product that is not a marketplace, probably the most important thing is just building a great product. In the case of a marketplace, building a great product is largely irrelevant. Actually, I would say it's like almost it's like third or fourth priority. Number one priority is liquidity. So actually, it's just it's a reframing of what your product is.
What the product is, exactly.
Exactly. In a marketplace, your product that you're selling to demand is the supply that you have. And the product that you are offering supply is the demand that you have. And so as long as you keep trying to build supply and demand, and you can build a successful marketplace. And there are lots of really good ones out there that have essentially followed the same playbook and similar growth trajectories.
Yeah, I'm surprised how many marketplace founders I meet who are not obsessed with transactions. And so like they'll be working on supply, they'll be working on demand, they'll be working on this, that, and the other. And you say, well, how many people have actually done the thing? How many matches have you made? And they're like, well, we haven't launched yet. It's like, you haven't launched yet. well, surely you could make one match today, right? Like, couldn't you get one transaction to happen? Couldn't you eBay one Beanie Baby right now? Is there any way to make that happen? And they're just, as you say, they have a misunderstanding of what the product is. And again, it goes back to that mental models thing. Their mental model of what they're making is wrong. They think they're making a piece of software, but the product is this experience that people have when they need something, they're able to get it.
That's right.
So do you want to talk about your exit from Udemy? I know we could
Happy
skip
to.
over that if you want to, but I feel like it's like a lot of founders have had that experience, but are not willing to talk about it. I feel like you've been really open in sharing it. And I think it's important for people to know, like, what's this like?
Yeah, I mean, so I was the third co-founder at Udemy. My two co-founders were childhood friends, and of course, they own more of the business than I did, and so, but over time, as the business grew, I started to take on a lot of what I would call like CEO responsibilities or COO responsibilities. I was running the board meetings. I was in charge of all investor relations. Um, I handled all of our press interviews, and I ran our supply and demand teams. Whereas my co-founder Aaron and Oktay, Oktay was more like a CTO, so he did engineering solely. Aaron ran product design, engineering, and also I think a critical thing that Aaron did that I did not truly appreciate was that he was the CEO and he made the final call on any big decisions. Mm-hmm. And I was fairly good, I think, at bringing those decisions to him. So he really got to weigh in on a lot of our critical decisions. But over time, I think this dynamic was a little tough for us because I felt like I was like, kind of a co-CEO, but it wasn't clear. And then I also felt like Aaron was, and Aaron was just sort of letting me, not I felt like, I feel today like Aaron and I kind of just started operating in our own silos and not having a ton of communication between us. And that is at that exact moment, I made my first set of like, management mistakes of just like, getting emotional. We talked about this earlier in the thing where you could tell that I kind of don't do this as much anymore. I still do it, to be clear. You can't change fully, but I used to get fairly emotional for not very good reasons about things, or at least it wasn't obvious what the reason was. The underlying reason was I was really stressed and nervous that we weren't going to hit our 20% growth. But the actual thing that I got nervous about wasn't directly related to that, and my team didn't totally get it. So they went to Aaron and said, "Hey, Aaron, like, Gagan's pretty intense. Like, can you work on this?" And unfortunately, Aaron took it the wrong way. And this is my current read on it. Aaron took it pretty hard and was like, I don't want people to be this upset and frustrated. And so, we talked about it, and simultaneously, like, I am like, look, Aaron, like, you're not doing a lot of the jobs that I kind of need you to do. And so we ended up having conflict outside of this issue. So these two things kind of happened at the same time. And at some point,
it's so common for co-founders to think that if they each go into their own silo and don't communicate, that will reduce conflict. And like, to be going back to our original concept about trust, you can't build trust that way. And so at first it works great. Everything's fine. And then all of a sudden it's not fine.
Yeah, because at that point, Aaron didn't have enough context to know what I was like behind when he wasn't around, and he wasn't around very much. So he didn't really know even what I was like when I just got frustrated in general. Like, he didn't see those things. Mm-hmm. I honestly think that if he had seen them, he probably would have just coached me on it and we would have worked together on it. But unfortunately, it was unseen, and a few other like kind of random events occurred. Like, someone left the company and wrote a blog post about it, which like she then later took down. But at that time, and her blog post doesn't reference activities that I did. It references activities that my team members did, but the blame all fell on me. And so all of this sort of just like this storm of things happened in a span of 3 months. And Aaron, I think, just made a call and said, look, we're going to raise our Series B in 6 months. I don't have 3 months to work with Gagan, because if I take that 3 months and it doesn't work out, then, he might raise the Series B and be in charge of and own, he has the relationship with the investors, like blah, blah, blah. So eventually Aaron was just like, you're fired. And he fired me one day, and it kind of came out of the blue. I had no idea this was possible or like what's going to happen that quickly. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because now we're pretty good friends, I would say. Like, and it's because I think both of us, it took time to cool off for sure. I was really upset. And I was also fairly like depressive about it, or like, not clinically depressed, but like, just sad about it.
Yeah.
And eventually I realized like, look, like, you know, um, Aaron was just making the best call he could. Being CEO is really, really hard, and you can't always know all of the information. And he made the call he could, and he felt it was right. And also, it turned out that Aaron eventually left the company. 3 or 4 years later, and someone else had been put in as CEO even before he left. And so a bunch of things happened together at the same time that led to us, happened over time that led to us realizing, hey, we should actually, we should make up, and we ended up becoming good friends.
Yeah. I
But
want to I
that's,
want to just ask about that, because a lot of co-founders, that's how they lose control of the company. Like if they really had each other's back, despite their different disagreements and differences, they would have been able to maintain it. But like internal conflict is like, usually the first step to then becoming weak to some external force. Do you feel like that would have been true? Like if you could go back in time and change how that partnership worked, do you think it would have changed the trajectory of the company in some way?
yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that today Udemy is like 2 to 4x undervalued. And one of the main reasons is because it doesn't have a founder decision maker who is
Yeah.
making core decisions for the company. And I'd like to think that if Aaron and I had stuck it out, we would have been able to have enough credibility with the board to be making decisions as CEO, and whatever my role would be, president. And I think Aaron probably would say something pretty similar, honestly. Um, uh, and so, yeah, I think it wasn't just detrimental to us; it was
Yeah.
also detrimental to the investors for taking over the company. I mean, they totally screwed it up. They probably reduced the downside risk. So they took the downside risk, like the company basically, like, maybe it had a chance of becoming like a few $100 million company instead of $1 billion company if they hadn't, taken more control of the company. But by taking full control of the company, they also capped the upside risk, the upside opportunity of the company. And it's not a $5 or $10 billion company today; it's $1.5 billion. And for those of you out there who are like hoping you can build your company up to a few hundred million, you may not think that's a big deal. But let me tell you, when you get to this point in your career, you're like, man, I could really use 2x the valuation right now. I mean, of course, I'm thrilled with the outcome, but I'd like the company to be valued at the place that it deserves, not just at the local maximum.
Yeah. In retrospect, do you wish you had put in more governance protections to prevent that from happening?
I mean, we had no leverage. There was just no way that was even possible. I think that like our first 3 rounds all happened where only one firm or individual investor said yes. So like we didn't have a choice.
Hmm.
Um, and as a result, we had really rough valuations and got fairly diluted, which also means that you lose control, because like
Yeah.
people don't realize this, but preferred stock can very quickly threaten to switch into common stock, which allows them to control any board members. Um, so I would say that I don't wish something that feels impossible.
Yeah.
Uh, what I do wish is that we had stuck together, and I
Hmm.
think that Aaron would say the same thing, but I don't know.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask him.
So let's come into the present. I'm sure you took some of those lessons into the creation of Maven. Tell us that story.
Yeah, I took different lessons in the creation of Maven. So, you know, 12 or 13 years after the founding of Udemy, I found myself at a crossroads. After Sprig, I had taken a few years off. I then came back and decided I was going to start another company or join another company early stage. And I discovered this like iteration or like evolution in learning that I thought was possible. So whereas in 2008 and 2009, when we started Udemy, people were not willing to learn live on the internet. Uh, in 2020, and this is before COVID, so 2019, 2020, I started to build a conviction that Zoom was now getting popular enough that people would want to learn live on the internet. Then of course COVID happens, and that just like feels like it's changed even more. And by the summer, I was just like, oh man, I got to start this thing. I got to start a company around live learning. And so I started Maven. And really, what we decided to hang our hat on is not live education, although that's a significant part of it, but what I call cohort-based education. It's this idea that it's really, really hard to complete a course if you do not have some accountability and peer review mechanism built into it. So, Udemy, the biggest criticism of Udemy and of Coursera is that people buy these courses and never finish them.
Oh,
And
yeah.
in reality, there's actually like anywhere, depending on what study you look at, between a 5 and 11% completion rate of courses that you buy when you buy asynchronous courses. I mean, that is abysmal, right? And of course, like, if someone takes 75% of the course, I think that's they probably got their money's worth. But there's a curve here, and a lot of people actually, probably more than 50, I'm just guessing, more than 50%, like literally never really even, engage with more than one or two lessons of it. So what I saw with live learning was that, you had like 80 to 90% attendance, right? Yeah, you had like, people were actually showing up to these things and they were learning. And so I decided to start a company, Maven, which is also a marketplace like Udemy, but it's built around the idea that when you're a professional and you make real, you have a real job and you have a real career, you are not going to be able to build in time to sit and watch videos at your computer and do it on your own pace. You want to be in class and have it on your calendar. And so, and that was the premise. It turns out that we added a bunch of other things. We realized that Udemy was a discount brand in a discount brand market, and Maven was going to be a premium brand in a much more senior market, because now we're targeting people who have means, who are mid-market mid-career. And so Maven has changed a lot. I actually was giving someone, I was recruiting someone the other day, and I was giving them 6 different things that we've changed from Udemy. So it's pretty different. But I'll highlight 2 of them. One is that it's cohort-based, and 2 is that it's expert-led. So the other big lesson is, we were lucky. We got Eric Ries on the platform early. We had, Dave McClure, and a couple other great people. But for the vast majority of Udemy instructors, it was not a critical factor to us whether or not they had real credibility in their space. They just had to know the material. So if you were a Python programmer who had, who was a good teacher, it didn't matter whether you were, you had no experience at a big company, you had no experience at a name brand, you had, no followership. You could teach on Udemy and you could be successful. On Maven, we care a lot more about the pedigree and the success of the instructor. And so what we're really selling is access to incredibly talented people who are 10 years ahead of you in your career, and to learn subjects from them that you would want to learn in order to grow in your own career.
Tell us a little bit about how it's going.
So the first 2 years, as I told you, was like a very rapid boom and bust. Because of COVID, we had insane tailwinds. And we also, I wasn't just COVID, we also just, our go-to-market strategy when we launched was really good. And we launched with a bunch of name brand creators with hundreds of thousands of followers. And we made 4 million in course sales in our first year. So our instructors were making tons of money. We only had 10 instructors. So that, people are really doing well. And then in year 2, we had to face reality, which is that, a lot of these people who have a lot of followers, they're not very good teachers. Being good at LinkedIn and Twitter does not make you good
Not
at
automatic.
long
Yeah,
form education. B, they didn't like teaching that much, because the type of person who is regularly posting on YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter, is used to a much quicker feedback loop than building an online course, which is like a 3 to 6 month feedback loop. Whereas normally, on Twitter, you post and within 24 hours, your post has hit its 98th percentile of its total reach. So they were used to shorter feedback loops. and they weren't always that credible. Like you can build a following without having worked in the industry for 10 or 20 years, because the following is all about direct to consumer, whereas the industry involves like, actual real work for a period of time. So
Mm-hmm.
we realized that customer, now there are really good people who were in that bucket who happen to be great teachers and happen to have 10 to 20 years of experience. But a lot of them weren't. And so that customer actually, we found out the hard way that they really didn't like Maven that much. And over the course of the next 2 years, even though they were making a ton of money, they almost all churned. And by year 3, we later found out, right, that actually 98% of them churned. So like it was
Wow.
awful, right? And so we had grown to the team to 30 people. We had, felt like we were killing it, and then we actually ended up having to go all the way down to, I think our lowest was probably 12 people.
Mm-hmm.
So we let go of a lot of people, or
That
we
must have been
we we
hard.
let them leave. And we launched the next iteration of Maven. Maven was a SaaS product essentially with 10%. We took 10% of the revenue, but it was software only. And
Mm-hmm.
then we launched a marketplace in year 2, about 2 years into the business, and it took a while, but now it's really working. And I'd say like that launch was a pivotal moment in our company. It's almost like we restarted the company, right? So
Yeah.
it's your classic like pivot, right? So even though it doesn't seem that different, we now all of a sudden, instead of just providing creators with a way to monetize their own audience, we were providing instructors with expertise, with an audience that they could teach their online courses to, and with the ability, and we were helping mid-career professionals learn things and get access to learning that they did not have access to. And so today, we're doing quite well. We haven't publicly shared our numbers. This is like actually the first time. I won't share them, in super detail, but we're growing over 100% year on year, and it's accelerating. I don't think it's going to continue to accelerate, but it is accelerating leading into the end of last year. We're having a really good start to this year, and when we're growing, what's most important is twofold. One, it means that our instructors are growing. So our
Mm-hmm.
instructors, we have hundreds of instructors now, and the average instructor is making like 80 to 120K a year in course sales, which is like, we're thrilled about, because
That's great.
it's a significant income. And there's a lot of people who are going full time on Maven, which is really amazing. And then for students, what this means is that now, if you want to learn how to be on the cutting edge of your industry, today Maven is one of 3 or 4 places online that are the best choices. And because of our momentum, I'm fairly confident that in 3 years, it will be the only place, or it will be far and away the best place for students to learn skills that are helpful for them in their career. So examples of skills are, if you want to learn product sense, our course by Shreyas Doshi, many people have called the best course they've ever taken
I'm
by any
sure.
institution in history, right? Like they think it's the best course ever.
That's
That's a
something
little
that's
bit of
something you can't learn anywhere else. He's like one of the only people who can teach it to you.
That's exactly right. And one of the only people who's willing to spend the time to teach it, which is
Yeah,
also part of
exactly.
it. I mean, maybe you could learn from Brian Chesky, but he's not going to teach a
He's a
course
little
on the
busy.
subject.
Yeah.
So yeah, Shreyas's course is fantastic. We have courses on, design thinking. We have courses on, the ROI of design, like explaining your product. We have courses on data for product management.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a product manager, you want to learn more about becoming analytical. And then probably the biggest category nowadays is AI for whatever subject you're in. So if
Of
you want to
course.
learn how to be cutting edge in AI, I'd say Maven is probably the number one place for that.
I'm shocked how many knowledge workers and just professionals in general seem to be way under investing in AI as a skill set. Yeah. And like
Absolutely.
really missing a chance for tremendous acceleration.
Yeah, no, I think the challenge is that like AI is actually way overhyped. Um, and at the same time, it's still useful. And it's hard for people to go from binary to a spectrum, right?
Totally. Oh
And
my
so I,
God.
I think it's so common for people to be like, oh, you know, AI got this wrong, or like I asked it a question, it didn't get the answer for me right, and oh, it sucks. And like, then the answer is just like, okay, I'm not going to use it. Like, or I saw this blog post and I could totally tell it was written by AI. Like, it sucks. And it's like, yeah, actually, like AI, like if you're writing your blog posts and you're publishing them and it's written by AI, like I'm sorry, but you're probably not a very good writer. I still do not believe that it is a good enough writer to replace like what I can do as a writer, right? Like, so I don't write my posts via AI. I don't write my emails via AI. However, if you want to make sure that your post is comprehensive in coming up with all of the different bullet points that you want to put into a post, let's say you're doing a survey of an industry, right? AI is fantastic at doubling your brainstorming capacity. Um, and we frequently will just ask AI to give us, what did we miss in this post?
Mm-hmm.
And it'll usually give us 2 or 3 things. So it's just that it's not amazing at everything like some people are trying to say, but it is a critical It is a critical way to improve the quality of your work. You just have to figure out where to use it. And I think one of the things that Maven does really well is like, we don't have a lot of like hype bullshit like you do on Twitter or LinkedIn, right? Like people are charging like, $500 to $1,000 for their courses and thousands of people are buying them every month, right? Like professionals from top tier companies, like you can't fake it if you're on Maven. And so I think we've done a good job of having a lot of content that can actually practically teach someone how to use AI in a way that they wouldn't have gotten if they just read on Twitter or social media.
Yeah. So many people are trying to use AI for one-shot deliverables, like basically just like write this blog post for me, do this thing for me, and that is a just huge red flag. Don't. It's really not good at that. I'll put in a plug for Jeremy Howard's course at Answer AI on dialogue engineering, but basically like, as you're saying, like if you use AI as your partner in building up your argument step by step, building up your program piece by piece, where it's still you are the person who is doing the assembly and providing the taste necessary to know if the thing is going in the right direction, it can be an enormous productivity accelerant. But there is some skill to that. It's not something that you just, log into ChatGPT and say, do all my work for me. Speaking of overhype, there's so much discussion about AI in education. I've got to get your thoughts about that. You've obviously doubled down big time on having humans teach other humans, skills that they can't get any other place. I think a lot of people are talking about how that's going to become obsolete. AI is going to do all the teaching and tutoring. Yeah, just what are your thoughts about the impact of AI in education, and what advice do you have to other people who want to see it integrated in a way you think is kind of healthy and productive instead of harmful?
Yeah, I mean, education is a really, really big industry. And so I actually believe that AI will have a major impact in education all the way up and down the stack. But the impact it's going to have at different places is going to be very different, right? So I'll just get Maven out of the way. Like, I know what AI is capable of. I think I have a pretty damn good understanding. Like, I use it every day. It absolutely could not teach Maven courses anytime soon. Like, we're probably talking like, I don't know the pace at which it's going to accelerate, but like we're probably talking 5 to 15 years from now. I would be surprised if before 5 years I'd be shocked. And somewhere in the 5 to 15 year range, I think AI might be good enough to actually teach a live Maven course, maybe, but it's nowhere close. So, the thing we sell is a person who has a lot of deep expertise in a very, very narrow subject. And AI is like the exact opposite. AI is not very good at highly, highly specific use cases. It's good at generalized use cases, right? It's the next iteration of search in my mind, and like everyone knows that, you cannot find all your answers on the internet for most of your hard questions at work. And that's true of AI. That said, I think AI is going to have a massive impact on education. And so I would agree with a lot of the hype. Let's talk about K-12 as sort of the main place where I think it's going to make a difference. It's hard to appreciate how much of a difference YouTube had on K-12 education for two reasons. One, it had almost no impact on the spend in K-12. Right?
So true. Oh my God, I never thought of that.
There's absolutely no, like, if you're running a business in K-12, YouTube is like practically irrelevant, right? So from a market standpoint, like you could argue like, hey, YouTube didn't really, maybe on the margins, there are certain types of publications in the education realm that no longer got traction, and people, the eyeballs went to YouTube and those advertisers were on YouTube, like maybe, but like for the most part, like most K through 12 just stayed the same from a dollar standpoint. However, students now learn in a completely different way. Like my cousin in India, who's like, he's now 18, but when he was, 12 and 10, was frequently like learning things that I wouldn't have learned until I was 18 to 20, because he can just search on YouTube and truly learn it online. And
Yeah.
so YouTube did have a huge impact. And I think AI will have that kind of impact on education, that it's going to be very unlikely that you will replace teachers, because teachers provide something AI and software cannot. They provide accountability, right? And and more importantly, honestly, like I hate to say this, but they provide jobs that are secured by the government, and the government is not going to get rid of those teachers anytime soon. So we have a whole nother problem in K through 12, which is that not only is it going to be hard to replace teachers on some level, but the teachers are also not going to get replaced because the government is nowhere close to politically being willing to, change the way the classroom is. In private schools, however, it will completely change. And I think you will see, and there's a school called Alpha School, and there's a bunch of schools that use Khan Academy as their rails, as one of their rails, like one of their main ways that they operate and teach. And I think in that world, you will start to see more and more schools and software that essentially like replace a teacher and allow a teacher to scale. So instead of teaching 30 students, you can teach 60 with the same teacher. You probably cannot teach 500 with one teacher, because what that teacher then needs to do in like the K through 12 space is actually hold accountable the student and like literally just like make sure that they're not like, cheating, make sure they're like motivated emotionally, which an AI might be able to do sometimes, but is not going to do all the time, and guide them. And that's actually how Alpha School runs their school. So it's a flipped classroom approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to happen. And then in college, I think it's going to have somewhat less of an effect. All students will be using AI. There will be AI on the margins in terms of cheating and things like that, and writing and stuff. But I think like, college is still mostly about the in-person experience with the professor. I think it's going to be very, very hard for AI to fully replace that, but it might dramatically enhance it. And then for professionals, again, I think it'll be like YouTube, where it's going to be bigger than YouTube, but it's not going to be, it's not going to change the spend as much as you might think.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're talking about teachers as if they are narrowly tailored to produce a certain kind of academic experience. But of course, the relational aspect with the student is a huge part of the advantage that human beings have with each other, that has academic dimensions, but also a lot of non-academic dimensions that no one even has a game plan for how that could be replaced. Although I'm sure eventually we'll get there.
Exactly.
Okay. Let me do a quick lightning round. You got a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay, it's one of my favorite things doing the research for these episodes is just to see other cool things that you've said and written over the years and get to ask you about it. Let me start with, you wrote this great piece for First Round Review a few years ago about the minimum viable testing process for evaluating startup ideas. What is it?
Well, I just riffed on your MVP thing, because people were, it's one of those things where every 10 years you need a new name for the same thing. And the reason you do is because people start to take the name and they forget the actual idea. And so the intent of that post, really, if I think about it honestly, is just like, look, guys, like MVPs are meant to be tests where you are evaluating a specific assumption and understanding how it works. They are not meant to be your product, ideally. And they don't even need to evolve into your product. And so I call it minimum viable testing, because I think of it as you're putting this thing out there that's totally fake. And like, it doesn't need to continue after that test. And I think one of the word product in MVP, which is impossible to know in advance, but got, because people
No,
baptize anything in any way.
No, it's true. It's
like,
true.
People eventually thought that your job was just to create a light version of the product you eventually would build.
Yeah, as if the phrase was minimum product, like
Yes,
minimal product, like
exactly.
just build something small. It's like, yeah, tried very hard to make that clear.
No, it was a great. I mean, it was great, but we needed. I felt like it needed some clarification. And I think for a lot
Oh,
of
for
people,
sure.
it really resonated. So
You said one of the things I really liked about the way you framed it is you talked about how with both Maven and Sprig, you had to test the atomic unit. Can you just give those examples real quick?
yeah, I mean, what is the thing that you're selling, right? Like, at Udemy and Maven, what we're selling is a course. So I tested one individual course. I wasn't just testing a marketplace of courses, because before testing a marketplace of course, I have to find out whether people want one course. And so that's what I did first. With Sprig, the atomic unit was one delivered meal, right? So I had to test the delivery process. And so I think most businesses, you could just name a business. Certainly, marketplace businesses all have an atomic unit, right? They all have like their listings of whatever they are selling, and so one listing, is an atomic unit. And so Airbnb, one home rental, on OutSchool, it's one class with a teacher. On eBay, it's one item that you're buying, right? So like that's the atomic unit. I think in other businesses, you would probably want to atomize not into units but into concepts or sales value, right? So like in a SaaS product, your atomic value is going to be like something is like, let's say you're selling HRIS software, right? Your atomic value is being able to run payroll without, solving a problem for someone that is clear and distinct, and you'd sell that. So it's different for different industries, but that's what an atomic unit is.
You said your dream is to build the largest university in the world. Explain.
Until I took Shreyas's course, I don't know that I had confidence that Maven could get there. I'll be honest. And I don't think our team fully believed it either. We were still working on this company and thought it was going to be a big company. But the vision for Maven is that today we have the best teachers in product and AI in the entire world. We are better than any MBA program for a product manager. Simply put, like there is no MBA program that can beat the educational experience that Maven offers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we cannot beat the relational experience that you get in an MBA program. We will eventually, but we can't today. So that's the atomic unit of a university from an education standpoint. It's a course, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we now have hundreds of them. Eventually, we'll have thousands of them. Eventually, we'll have tens of thousands, and eventually, we'll have hundreds of thousands of courses. And if those courses are as high quality as I think they can be, then we will have the best education in the world. If you believe that's possible, which I think it is, then the question is, how do you turn that into a university, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple ways. One way is you believe in unbundling. So actually, we provide the education and someone else provides the peer relationships, right? There's a different company out there that helps you network with your peers that now feels like you don't really need to go to university because you can just join this company for 2 years or 5 years and you get what you need, right? Maybe Maven provides that. But in some way, eventually, we will take the other parts of the university and include it in the Maven product, or include it in the same experience of life that Maven buyer is having, because the Maven buyer is also buying some other product that deals with that. And then finally, we need to deal with accreditation. And so at some point in the future, we'll have you can take 20 courses on Maven. We've got a third party who's, certified these courses. And they're saying that if you take these 20 courses, you might get a job at Google. You'll get the top of the line. You'll get to the front of the line of interviewing at Google for these set of positions. And if we can make that happen, then we've built an alternative to a university. And that's my goal.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned scholarship. What about the production of new knowledge and the promotion of new discoveries? Is that an important university function?
I'm it's not a revenue generating university function for most universities. For some it is. It's a cost thing.
Yeah.
So it is an important function of a university for society, but it's not an important function for the value proposition of the buyer. So the
Interesting.
buyer, so what I think will actually happen, hopefully, is we will continue to have research institutions funded by the government. Maybe we'll save the money that we're spending on universities and instead be more aggressive about providing direct scientific grants, right? But like we will still have, basic research throughout society, but we'll just do it in a different way and it won't be bundled with these other things. The reason I brought up education, accreditation, and relationships or community is because I do believe that those three things are core value propositions that eventually will need to be rebundled together.
I see.
I do not believe research needs to be a part of that.
Interesting. You talked about the importance of going into monk mode from time to time. What's monk mode?
Monk mode is when you're doing a lot of essentially not meeting with people, or like you're not doing your day-to-day grind of showing up, waking up, getting on your computer or going to the office, having 10 meetings, reading stuff on the internet in between, etc. It's like you need to really think, and real thinking doesn't occur in 30-minute chunks when talking to other people. So monk mode is, and I've done this many times in my career. It's when I decide, hey, I'm not taking coffee chats. Or maybe I'll take 1 or 2 days a week and I'll only meet people then. And I won't meet people the other days of the week, right? I'm not taking coffee chats. I'm doing a lot of reading. I'm doing a lot of thinking. I'm experiencing life as a consumer. I'm a consumer guy. So I'm experiencing life as a consumer. As a B2B person, you could go and do the job that you think you might eventually, work on. But that's what monk mode is in my mind.
One last thing. I really appreciate the vulnerability you've shown, not just in this conversation, but many times talking about, the downsides of entrepreneurship and the being fired. And you had a quote, which I really liked. You said, "This too shall pass. It felt like the world had ended when I was fired." And then, talked about how it opened the doors for your next opportunity. And there's got to be somebody listening to this right now who has not yet learned to differentiate what happened to their job or to their company from what's happening to themselves. And so it can feel like you're going to die when you have this kind of fail. I so relate to that. I was like, oh my God, I can remember that feeling. It is awful. And, with experience, hopefully you get to the other side of it, you realize that you exist independently of the things that happen to you. Just, this too shall pass. What does that mean to you?
As long as you still have, as long as you can still breathe the air and walk the planet, you will continue to have opportunities come your way. And those opportunities may not seem sometimes what you're doing right now seems like the world to you, but the reality is that there was a world before this was the world to you, and there is a world after it. And so I would remember that and not take things so intensely, even though I know it's really hard. And then 2, I would remember to maintain your world outside of work as you grow and operate, because it really does help you, touch grass and keep yourself sane and humble. And I'm very grateful that I have an amazing home life and personal life, and I've kind of always had. It certainly suffered at times when I'm working really hard, but I've always had, really good friends and family. So, and I highly recommend cultivating that if that's something that you need, if you don't already have it.
All right, Gagan, thank you very much for taking time. Appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate you having me.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.